Today, by popular request, we are out here taking a look at the all-new 2017 Audi Q7. The Q7 is Audi's largest crossover. It is a three-row crossover, and it competes with a wide variety of other crossovers out there, all the way from something like an Acura MDX at the inexpensive end, all the way on up to a very expensive Mercedes-Benz GLS. The GLS is Mercedes' new name for the GL, and we will be seeing that also as a 2017 model, just like this Audi Q7. Audi has long preferred the one sausage in multiple different lengths school of design. They also prefer design evolution to design revolution. And that's why even though this Q7 is completely new for 2017, it looks very much like every other Audi product out there. Looking a little bit more closely, however, you will see some details that are very different than before. We have these more aggressive headlamps and a slightly different grille. It's a little bit more angular than it was in the past. Overall, this front end looks very much like the Audi TT we recently reviewed, and more like the TT in many ways than the current generation Q5. In case you're wondering, these little dots right down here are not fog lamps because Audi's new all-weather lamps are actually integrated into the headlamp module itself. It's actually this energized section right down here in this corner. This is the main beam, these two are the high beams, and then this is the all-weather lamp. The all-weather lamp shines off to the side of the road and to the front of the road. It's also used as a cornering lamp. Audi says this is more effective than a traditional LED fog lamp. At just under 200 inches long, the Q7 is one of the larger entries in this segment. This is a few inches longer than a BMW X5 or a Volvo Xc90. The big difference in the overall side profile between this and the Volvo is really right up here. We have a longer hood than we find in the Xc90. That is important because it's just the way that the drivetrain is oriented under the hood that Audi needs this long hood up front. It actually means that we get a little bit smaller of a space inside than you do find in that Volvo. To help compensate for the overall size of the Q7 and help make it drive a little bit smaller, especially in parking lot situations, we do have available rear steering. It does mean that parking lot or mall maneuvers are actually easier in this than you'll find in something smaller. Out back, the Q7 is largely reminiscent of the previous generation model. However, we do get all of those latest Audi styling cues with new tail lamp modules with these T-shaped LED light pipes inside. And of course, they separate the rear fog lamp and the backup light into this separate module below. In kind of an interesting styling cue that we have seen from Audi in the past, you'll notice that the tail lamp modules themselves actually wrap from the rear of this tailgate all the way into the side of the vehicle. You notice that little cutout section right there on the side. This particular design gives the rear end a slightly more finished look when it comes to the tail lamp modules because they aren't divided into two different pieces. As I said before, the Q7 has a relatively long hood because we do have engines sitting longitudinally in the vehicle, but it also has a long front overhang because of the design of the Audi Quattro system. And the overhang is the distance between the front axle, which is right about here, to the front of the vehicle, which is right about here. That's because even though this uses a very similar transmission to what we find in the BMW X5, they're both 8-speed ZF transmission units. The one in the X5 starts after the front axle. And in fact, actually, a large portion of the engine is shoved after the front axle. In this particular vehicle, however, Audi combines the all-wheel drive system and the transmission into one case. This particular design choice causes the entire engine to sit in front of the front axle, and that causes some people to incorrectly assume that Audis are front-wheel drive biased. This is not a front-wheel drive biased or front-wheel drive based vehicle. This is, again, as I said, using the same rear-wheel drive 8-speed automatic transmission in essence as the BMW X5, and it does send the majority of the power to the rear wheels. The difference is just that the engine is sitting in front of the front wheels, not that the front wheels are driving the car most of the time, and that is different than you see in the Acura MDX or the Volvo Xc90. Speaking of engines, there is only one engine available for 2017, although we do expect to see a variety of engines in the future. This is a 3-liter supercharged V6 that we see in a variety of other Audi models. It produces 333 horsepower and 325 pound-feet of torque. At the moment, the Q7 is also available only as an all-wheel drive vehicle in the United States. When properly equipped, the Q7 can tow up to 7,700 pounds, which is a great deal for this segment. That is notably higher than you'll find in the Volvo, the Acura, or the Infiniti competition. In terms of front seat comfort, the Q7 scores very well in this segment. I think these seats are a little bit more comfortable in base form than the base seats that we find in the X5. And I think in the top end form, which is the 18-way power seat, they're a little bit more comfortable than the top end seat in the X5 as well. However, they're not quite as comfortable as the comparable Volvo seat in the Xc90, although we do get a power tilt telescopic steering column, not a manual steering column in the Q7. It's also memory linked with the buttons right over here on the door. Back here in the second row, the Q7 really leads this segment. I have an exceptional amount of legroom sitting right here behind myself. I'm 6 feet tall and I have about 7 inches left here. I also have a decent amount of headroom, even though we also have the panoramic sunroof in this vehicle. The rear seats do have a decent amount of recline to them. This is the most reclined position, and then we have a very upright position to square off that cargo area in the back. The seats are very thickly padded, they're very comfortable, and one thing that I like is that they're actually a little bit higher off the ground, which makes it more comfortable for adults to sit in the back. Moving over to the middle seat, the Q7 surprises with a very comfortable middle seat. That's because the Q7 is quite large. Now the seat back cushion is obviously not as cushy as it is in the outboard seating positions, but I do have a decent amount of legroom. Not quite as much as I would find in some of those front-wheel drive biased vehicles, because we do have a driveline hump right here, but this middle seat is independently reclinable from the outboard seating positions. Scooting all the way over to the right of the vehicle, this front seat is all the way back in its tracks, so you can see I have a decent amount of legroom there. I can also recline this rear seat, of course, to make it a little bit more comfortable for me. Our particular model also has these very nicely integrated rear sunshades. Improving cargo practicality, the Q7 has a 40-20-40 folding rear seat back in the second row, and they're completely independent of one another, so you don't have to fold this outboard seat in order to fold this center seat. The second row seats slide forward and backward to help you apportion legroom between the second row and the third row a little bit more amicably. This is a two-step process to get into the third row that makes this a little bit more complicated than some of the competition. We first fold the seat all the way forward, then we pull this other lever, and that lifts the seat up and allows you to get into the back. The third row seats in our Q7 are electric folding, and they're actually 3 sets of buttons. There's one set right over here on the driver's side of the vehicle, there's another over there on the passenger side of the vehicle, and then there's a third in the cargo area. All of them do the same thing. All of them allow you to power fold the seats up or down. Now let's fold and flip this seat forward and then hop right back here into the third row. First thing you'll notice back here in the third row is that we have more latch anchors in the Q7. There are actually an additional 2 right over here in the third row that does make putting child seats in this back a little bit more convenient than some. Now I didn't find the third row of the Q7 quite as comfortable as the brand new Xc90. The seat bottom cushions seem to be a little bit closer to the floor. I don't have quite as much legroom as I did have in the Xc90. However, as I said, this is one of the larger 3-row crossovers out there, and this is still something that I could do at 6 feet tall for say 30-45 minutes without a problem at all. When it comes to cargo capacity, you'll find just under 15 cubic feet of space behind the third row seats. That's with them up right here in this position, and you won't find any more storage space under the load floor. That's because we do have a subwoofer down here. You'll also find the can of Fix-A-Flat and the tire inflator down there as well. That's because we don't have a spare tire in the Q7. When it comes to my exclusive trunk comfort index, the Q7 scores very well. We have this power folding third row seat, and as I said before, we have the power controls for the folding third row, not only here, but also on those side doors. That makes it a lot easier for passengers to open that side door, discover the third row is folded, and then put it back up into place. We also have the optional air suspension in our Q7, and like we see in other models out there, we have buttons right over here on the side to raise and lower the vehicle to make cargo loading a little bit easier. I am, however, going to have to deduct 1 point from my trunk comfort index because we don't have a spare tire under this cargo load floor, and it is a little bit smaller than we find in some of them out there. Still, I'm going to have to give this 9 out of 10 points. As we take a look around the interior, keep in mind that we are in one of the upper end trims, so this may not look exactly like what you find on the dealer lots. Our model does have the panoramic sunroof there. We also have height adjustable seat belts for both the driver and the front passenger. As you'd expect from any vehicle in this price category, the front door panels are entirely made of soft touch plastic. So we have soft touch upper, middle section right here that matches the seat fabric, and then of course the soft touch lower compartment with the bottle holder and additional storage. The interior design sort of reminds me of the old Audi 5000 from several decades ago, with this large bank of air vents that runs right across the dashboard. Now the outboard air vents that you see on the left and right side of your screen with the little thumb area here so you can actually control the vent, these areas are your typical air vents. They put out air the same volume that you're normally used to. Then we have this large air vent, which is actually enabled and disabled by a button right next to the on-off knob for that outboard air vent right there. When you press that button, then this large air vent is putting air out, but it's more diffuse than those other air vents on the side. Below that, we have a moderately sized bin-style glove compartment. Wasn't able to stick large tablet computers inside. The Q7 gets Audi's latest version of MMI, and so we have this large screen right up here on the dashboard. It is a wide format screen, and you'll notice that we do have Apple CarPlay integration and Android Auto in this version. Although it's not a touchscreen, you do have to use the control dial in order to navigate around this interface. Working our way down from that, you'll find the Audi Drive Select system. This controls the way the suspension and the engine and the transmission all behave. We have Auto start stop enable disable, stability and traction control button right over here, park sense button. This also controls the 360-degree camera, hill descent control, and then a button to retract that screen back into the dashboard. Below that, we find the 4-zone automatic climate control that is optional. You can control all 4 zones from the front controls right here. Below the 4-zone climate control, we have a small storage cubby that has a 12-volt power outlet or an ashtray in certain markets. We also have the large touchpad interface for this new Audi MMI system. This new interface should be easy to understand if you've used MMI in the past. We have direct access buttons to map and navigation, telephone, radio, and media like we've had before. We also have a control knob that rotates around, toggles up, down, side to side, and clicks down to enter. And then we have this large touchpad. This is somewhat similar to previous generations of Audi MMI that used a touchpad, but they've gone a few steps further. So we now have contextual buttons on either side that toggle through things in the screen. We have a menu button, a back button, and then preset buttons right across the top. You can, of course, do finger writing recognition for input right here on the center of the screen. Below that, we have a joystick-style shifter. Press P for park. We press this button on the side if you want to change gears, and then we pull the shifter down for drive or all the way back up for reverse, and you'll notice it always returns to center. If we're down here in the drive mode, we can also toggle it over to the right for our manual shift mode, up for up and down for down in that particular mode. Again, press P for park, and it will return to the center. To the right of that, you'll find this very small power, volume, and track forward-backward button. Rotate it around for volume, click down for power for the Audi MMI system, and you toggle side to side for track forward and backward. We also have 2 relatively small cup holders right over here. We do have a large takeout soda here, and you'll notice it doesn't actually go all the way down inside that cup holder. Between the front seats, we have a shallow storage area right here, and then we have an armrest for the driver and the front passenger. These are separate, so you can actually slide them forward and backward separately from one another, but they do ratchet into position together. Opening the lid reveals a fairly small storage compartment. You'll also find 2 USB ports and an auxiliary input right there at the back of that area. One thing to note is that we no longer need a specialty cable. You just use your regular old USB cable to attach your media device. In addition to the Audi MMI system right over here on the dashboard, we also have this LCD instrument cluster over here on the left side of your screen. This is very similar to what we see in the current generation Audi TT. Because the Q7, when you equip it with this display, still maintains the central MMI display, we don't see quite the same array of options and features inside this display as we see in the Audi TT. As we see in the Audi TT, this display is controlled via this button arrangement on the steering wheel. We have a back button, we have a view button, which changes the view there on the screen, contextual buttons that toggle side to side. We also have this scroll up and down and click down to enter button, and then this button changes between the various screens. Versus the Audi TT, the mapping interface is also somewhat more limited because we can't enter a destination right here on the screen. We can only choose between our last destinations and our favorites. You can't actually enter a new address. This display also has your typical trip computer information, so your date and time, fuel consumption, long-term trip computer, that sort of thing going on as well. The steering wheel design is a 4-spoke design with this large split spoke right down here at the bottom, but you can put a few fingers through there if you prefer. We have sport grips right up top, but you won't find sport grips lower on the steering wheel. It is thickly rimmed, and we have shift paddles on the back, up on the right, down on the left. On the right side of the steering column, we'll find the voice command button, phone hang-up pickup button, optional heated steering wheel button, repeat the last navigation instruction, and then we can also use this button over here to toggle side to side, track forward, backward, volume up, down, and click to mute. As we see in other Audi models, the cruise control is right down here on a stalk below the turn signal stalk. We have the optional radar adaptive cruise control in this vehicle, so we do have a distance button right over here. The transmission that Audi uses in the Q7 is ZF's absolutely excellent 8-speed automatic transmission. The shifts are crisp, they're also very, very quick. This transmission, coupled with the low-end torque that we get out of the supercharger and this 3-liter 6-cylinder engine, are why this vehicle ran from 0 to 60 in 6.1 seconds. I'm going to give this an A in terms of its overall acceleration score. This ran 0 to 60 faster than the lighter BMW X5 with its twin-turbo 6-cylinder engine is just about the same 0 to 60 as the considerably lighter Acura MDX with its 9-speed automatic. Now this 8-speed automatic transmission is much smoother than ZF's 9-speed because the design is actually very, very different. The 2017 Q7 lost a considerable amount of weight versus the 2015 model, but this is still fairly heavy for this segment. Audi compensates to a large degree with a very, very well-tuned active suspension in this particular model. The active air suspension is optional and very wide tires. Our model has the wide 285 with summer tires, which really help out the braking score. We ran from 60 to 0 in just over 120 feet, which is incredibly short for a vehicle that weighs nearly 5,000 pounds. That's actually shorter than the much lighter Acura MDX or the XC90. It just about ties with the BMW X5. Even though our model has the wide tires and it also has the optional 4-corner steering, this model is just not as nimble as the lighter entries in this segment. The Acura MDX has considerably narrower tires, but because it is so much lighter, it actually doesn't handle that much worse than the Q7. However, on the flip side, the Volvo Xc90 has a slightly better weight balance. It's also about 500 pounds lighter, and it actually feels more pleasing to drive out on these winding mountain roads than this Audi does. That is kind of an interesting twist, because the Q7, as I said, has a rear power bias, not a front power bias, although this does have that heavier front end. The heavier front end is noticeable when you drive this back-to-back with a Mercedes-Benz GLE or a BMW X5. When it comes to the ride, the Q7 scores incredibly well, especially if you get this optional air ride suspension. The Q7 and the Xc90 are kind of interesting vehicles in this segment because you can get that 4-corner air suspension as an option. The base models do have regular steel springs. These are the kind of vehicles where you can really easily tell the difference between an air suspension and a regular suspension if you're kind of toying between the two. They do have a slightly more disconnected feel in general behind the wheel. Even though we can put this into the dynamic mode, which does firm up the air suspension, it still feels a little bit more floaty-boaty than a traditional steel spring suspension. Although the air ride suspension in the Q7 does have an off-road height, like every other air suspension out there, it does compromise the ride a little bit. And that's because it's basically pushing the wheels all the way down to the bottom of their suspension travel in order to give you the maximum height, and that does mean you have less suspension travel overall. The Q7 with the air suspension definitely soaks up the potholes and bumps out here on this gravel road better than almost every other vehicle in this segment. I say this ties very closely with Volvo's Xc90 in terms of overall air ride suspension feel. It's actually quite similar to the top-end versions of the Mercedes GL as well. We scored 69.5 decibels at 50 miles an hour, which ties us with the BMW X5 and makes it only a little bit louder than some Mercedes models. When you're driving the Q7 hard, we do get a little bit more engine noise than we get in some of the competition. We do get a little bit more road noise than some of the competition, especially if you get the steel spring suspension. However, overall this does perform very well in this segment. Fuel economy in the Q7 is the one area where this Audi disappointed me. That's because we've been averaging 19 miles per gallon in mixed driving. That is definitely a few miles per gallon lower than we averaged in the Volvo Xc90 with its 2-liter 4-cylinder engine, even though both models have essentially identical EPA scores. Audi has announced that they will be putting their 2-liter 4-cylinder engine into the Q7 very soon, and I do expect that model to get very similar fuel economy to the Xc90 in T5 trim. My overall impression of the Q7 out on the road is that Audi has definitely done a good job of removing weight and making the Q7 feel more engaging and driving smaller than it did before. It's especially noticeable out on these winding mountain roads where the Q7 definitely feels much more nimble than it did in the past. The last generation of the Q7 just felt big and heavy all of the time. Audi decided to start the pricing on the Q7 at $54,800, and that base model does come as a 3-row crossover with LED headlamps and a sunroof. It is actually quite well equipped for the luxury segment. Now, $54,800 is notably higher than the Acura, the Infiniti, or the Volvo. However, we get more feature content in the base Q7 than you find in those base competitors. In addition, the Q7 does start as a 3-row crossover, and for instance, the BMW X5 and the Volvo Xc90 do not start as 3-row crossovers. They actually start as 2-row crossovers. Then you have to actually bump up some trim levels in order to get the 3rd row in the back. The next stop up is the Premium Plus model that gives you the navigation system, blind spot information system, and a few other features as well. Top-end trim is the Prestige trim at $64,300 that gives you the Bose 3D audio system that our particular model has here. There's speakers all over the interior. The Prestige model gives us that 12.3-inch LCD instrument cluster that we've been seeing in this particular model, as well as the heads-up display and a few other features as well. You'll notice that you don't find that 12.3-inch LCD instrument cluster until you get to the top-end trims of this Q7, and you do find it in some of those other vehicles at lower-end trims. Fully loaded, your Q7 should set you back just under $90,000. Let's start out our comparisons by diving straight into the Volvo Xc90 because it is probably the toughest competitor for the Q7 and the one that most people have been asking me about. The Q7 is a brand new model for 2017. The Xc90 was a brand new model for late 2016, so they're both quite fresh. And it's very obvious that both Volvo and Audi are going after very similar kinds of customers. Audi and Volvo have very different approaches to performance these days. Audi is continuing with their classic Quattro all-wheel drive system, which is again integrated into a ZF 8-speed automatic transmission, rear-wheel drive power bias in this particular vehicle, although a strong front weight bias. They have very similar performance numbers. They both have 8-speed automatic transmissions, although this particular vehicle is about 0.2 of a second faster to 60. Now, Volvo gets there with a 2-liter 4-cylinder engine under the hood producing 316 horsepower, This one, of course, has that 3-liter supercharged 6-cylinder, producing 333. Because the Q7 is heavier than the Volvo, there is not a huge performance difference between the two, even though we have a slightly more advantageous transmission in this particular vehicle and, of course, that extra power out of it. The weight difference means that the Volvo is actually the better handling option. It's a little bit more nimble out on the road than the Q7. The Q7 definitely feels heavier, especially when you're out on your favorite winding mountain road. Even though the Q7 will give you more thrust, it's not quite as much fun to throw into the corners. Both the Q7 and the Volvo have large and practical cargo areas in the back, although the Volvo has a hair more room. The third row in both is quite comfortable. Again, the Volvo has a slight lead there. The Q7, however, has a slight lead when it comes to second row comfort. The Volvo fights back with a slight lead in terms of first row comfort. When it comes to towing, there is no competition. The Audi Q7 will tow more than 50% more than you can tow in that Volvo Xc90. Interestingly enough, even though the Volvo is actually available as a front-wheel drive crossover now, it actually looks a little bit less like a front-wheel drive vehicle than the Q7 here. And that's because of that large front overhang we have in the Audi model. When it comes to fuel economy, the two perform very similarly, but it depends on how you drive it. You have to be an awful lot more careful with this than with the Volvo in order to actually get your EPA ratings. If you drive them equally, as I have been driving them this week, you'll actually get about 2 to 3 miles per gallon less in the Q7 than the Volvo, even though their numbers are very, very similar. Of course, Volvo does have that incredibly expensive T8 plug-in available right now, and there's no plug-in from Audi yet at this time. However, we do expect to see versions of the Q7 with turbo diesel engines under the hood, as well as hybrid systems in the near future. On first glance, it may appear that the Xc90 is considerably less expensive than the Q7. However, they're a little bit closer than you might think, because the $43,950 base price for the new Xc90 is actually the front-wheel drive T5 version. The most comparable model to this would be the all-wheel drive T6 that starts at $49,800. Of course, by the time you add things like the sunroof, the LED headlamps, that sort of thing that are going on base in the Q7, you end up just a few $1,000s apart. Like the Volvo, Acura's MDX starts as a front-wheel drive vehicle. If you want the all-wheel drive version, it's just over $45,000. Fully loaded, however, it's $57,230, considerably less than the Q7. The MDX is one of the lighter entries in this particular segment, and as a result, it actually performs very similarly to the Q7, both in terms of handling and in terms of acceleration. They actually tied in their acceleration score at 6.1 seconds, 0 to 60. Now, the MDX with its brand new 9-speed automatic transmission is just not as smooth as this vehicle with its 8-speed automatic transmission. The MDX isn't quite as refined, it's not quite as luxurious as the Q7, but it is considerably less expensive. It actually gets slightly better fuel economy as well. In terms of general driving dynamics, although the MDX starts as a front-wheel drive vehicle, it does get Acura's super handling all-wheel drive system. And super handling all-wheel drive can send a majority of the power to the rear axle. That's actually different than we see in the Volvo Xc90, because assuming all 4 tires have traction, the Xc90 can never send more than 50% of the power to the rear. In order to send more than that, it actually does require some wheel to start slipping somewhere. That's not going on in the Q7 right here or the Acura MDX. The BMW X5 starts just $100 less than the Q7, but you get considerably less content in that vehicle. You do get the 3-liter turbocharged 6-cylinder engine, but you don't get the third row, you don't get the LED headlamps, etc. In addition, the X5 manages to actually be slower than the Q7 in our tests. It is about 0.4 of a second slower than this model that we've been testing right here. Of course, BMW does have faster X5s available. You can get the X5 with their V8 twin-turbo engine, but that will set you back $71,500 starting. That will be faster than the Q7, however, it will also be considerably more expensive. You'll actually get less going on the inside for that base price as well. When it comes to driving dynamics, the X5 wins over the Q7. The Q7 definitely feels large even in this version, even though it has lost a considerable amount of weight over the last generation model. This weighs nearly 5,000 pounds, and even though Audi has stuck quite wide tires on it, it's difficult for the car to hide its weight. And since a large portion of that weight is actually sitting right up here on the front axle, it tends to feel a little bit more front heavy than the X5 especially. On the flip side, of course, the Q7 is a much better value than that X5. Mercedes doesn't really have a direct competitor to the Audi Q7 at this time. They have the GLE and they have the all-new GLS. These are basically the artists formerly known as the ML and the GL. The GLE 350 starts at $51,100, however, it's a decent amount slower than the Q7. It also doesn't have a third row. The GLE 400 is $64,600. It still doesn't have a third row, and it's a decent amount more expensive than the model we've been driving here. Now the GLE does feel more nimble, it drives a little smaller than the Q7, but you will definitely pay for the additional refinement and that Mercedes logo on the front. Mercedes hasn't announced pricing for their brand new GLS, which is replacing the GL, but you can expect it to start between $65,000 and $68,000 starting, and going on up to about $130,000 if you fully load it and get those AMG versions. You'll expect to pay about $5,000 to $10,000 more than the Q7 for about the same feature set. Lately, Mercedes has been repositioning their brand as the premium option in the luxury segment. I think that's the right thing for Mercedes. I do like the way that new GLS looks, but is it a better value than the Q7? I would say certainly not. The Q7 is a much better value. With everything tallied up, the Q7 and the XC90 are my two top picks in this segment, and I have to say it was very, very difficult to choose between the two. I really like some aspects of the Q7, and I really like some aspects of the XC90. The drivetrain in this vehicle I like actually a little bit more than the XC90. I just like the way ZF's 8-speed automatic transmission shifts. They both have very, very similar feature sets. Volvo's new Sensus system seems to be a little bit more practical. It's not quite as sexy as this particular system, but it actually takes up less dashboard space because it has that tablet-style infotainment cluster, and you do the finger writing recognition right on that screen. You don't take up any center console real estate for that controller. So the overall interior design of the Q7, although very, very attractive, very luxurious, is just a little bit busier than the XC90, and I do like the more simple design going on in that Volvo. Not only is the Q7 faster than the XC90 in this form, Audi has a reputation for sticking their twin-turbo V8 under every hood that it will fit in. I expect it to fit under this hood, and that will turn the Q7 into a rocket ship compared to the Volvo. Of course, that Q7 rocket ship is going to cost you considerably more than the XC90, and that's really where the Volvo fights back, because the Volvo is going to be a few $1,000s less than the Q7 across the board. Because of the Volvo's slightly lower price tag, slightly better handling feel, and I think slightly more attractive exterior look than the Q7, I am going to give it the top pick in this segment, but you can't go wrong by picking the Q7. And I would take the Q7 over the Mercedes-Benz GLS because this is a much better value. I would also take this over the Acura MDX. I think it's worth paying the extra amount. Especially if you're taking a look at that top-end version of the MDX, you should take a look at a mid-level trim of the Q7. Thanks for taking the time to check out this video. Again, I'm Alex Dykes. Be sure and click that subscribe button down there at the bottom of your screen, and I'll see you next week.